that, along with the combination of Jerome Powell's very encouraging forward guidance on the Fed's position, also lifted the markets.
And
I see
Schumer
you got
too.
cut off there. Guy, what were you about to say?
No, I'm saying, and Schumer's announcement today that he feels confident that
Who's speaking,
Schumer,
James?
yes.
Okay, what's that you said? What did Chuck Schumer say?
So Chuck Schumer said today that he met with the entire caucus and that he feels confident that they're going to pass the stimulus. So after that, the market really took a dive
off.
up. Mm-hmm.
Well, I think that you're absolutely right about that. So vaccine news, Jerome Powell testimony, and encouraging comments coming from one of the leaders of the Congress about movement on the rescue package. I agree with you 100%. That's excellent. Getting back to you, Nick, what was your comment? Also, the technology bubble, what? Okay, so
we saw some bizarre moves by Catherine Woods and ARK that she doubled down on Tesla yesterday. She bought a bunch of Tesla shares yesterday.
Who is this?
Catherine Woods from ARK Invest.
Pardon me for the disturbance. Okay.
I was talking about Catherine Woods.
Maybe there's something that you're looking at.
Catherine Woods. Who is Catherine Woods? I know that name.
She is considered one of the best investors right now in Wall Street. I think her portfolio more than doubled this year after she doubled down on Tesla and bunch of any other active ETFs she's managing.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, it goes by ARK.
So she's at ARK Capital. I see. Okay, well, so she's making moves, you said, in Tesla. Okay.
She
I think
a bunch of stock of Tesla yesterday.
Excuse me?
She bought a lot of Tesla yesterday.
Okay.
And
well, that's good for Tesla, of course.
I also wanted to add that this morning, the 10-year yield hit 1.4%.
The 1-year yield hit 1.4%. Okay, so there is a belief that there is a concern among some people that a rescue package and continued accommodative policy making by the Federal Reserve is going to lead to dramatic borrowing and spending by consumers and businesses, and that's going to put inflationary pressure into the windscreen or onto the radar screen of the Fed, which is going to cause them to do what in the foreseeable future? Raise interest rates. I personally believe that that's a little bit overblown, but nevertheless, I understand that it's an undercurrent of fear that runs through every recovery. When is inflation going to set in, and when is the Fed going to raise rates? So with that, I want to extend my praise on your embrace of current events today. I'm just looking at some of my notes, and I'd like to move on to our lesson for the day. Thank you very much for the feedback. As I said, we're looking at a review. You'll have a chance to go through that in more detail, but it takes into consideration all the work that we've done so far. Next here, I've summarized for you global indicators and domestic indicators that we have reviewed since the beginning of the semester, things like the oil markets and Brent and WTI oil prices. Of course, the international money markets. We've talked about short-term money markets. We've also discussed income inequality, the unemployment numbers, the labor force participation rate, the alternative measures of unemployment. We've discussed some of these other indicators that are barometers of the health of the economy, whether here in the US or abroad. What I'd like to do now is I'd like to move on to a broader discussion about trade and the idea of whether or not trade is an opportunity or threat to workers. We know that exports do what? They lead to more. Exports do what? They lead to more jobs and income for domestic workers. We know that wages increase for the workers whose skills are going to be scarce. And we know that cheap imports does what? It leads to rising unemployment and decreased wages for unskilled workers in import competing industries. So things like apparel and shoe manufacturing are going to hurt those domestic industries. We also know that jobs lost in one industry can be replaced by jobs gained in another or in the same industry. What would be an example of the same industry where jobs are lost and gained? Think about climate change and what's going on now in the energy markets.
Yeah, I guess moving from like oil to, or mining to renewable energy.
You're absolutely right. That is excellent. In my note, I thought coal mining, moving to solar energy, or any of the alternative clean energy, any of the other clean energy alternatives. That's excellent. That's exactly what I was thinking. Exactly. Thank you. Moving along, let's talk about some of the advantages and disadvantages of globalization. We know that among the various advantages of globalization are increased productivity and standards of living. We know that one of the disadvantages is millions of jobs being lost to low-wage labor markets, as we've seen over the last 40 years in the United States, as more and more jobs have been outsourced. We know that global competition and cheap imports keeps prices down and keeps inflation less likely. That's a good thing. We also know that millions of workers fear getting fired, particularly workers that are in import competing industries, because it becomes very hard to compete against low-wage labor markets. We know that open economies promote technological innovation and development. As we've discussed, we know that labor faces demands for wage concessions because of jobs that are exported abroad that make those industries less profitable. We know that one of the advantages of globalization has been that jobs in export industries tend to pay about 15% more than those in import competing businesses. On the flip side, the negative is that blue and white collar jobs increasingly are vulnerable to outsourcing. We know that global capital flows provide the US access to direct foreign investment. But at the same time, American workers lose their competitiveness when American businesses establish subsidiaries or they establish factories abroad in low-wage countries, excuse me. I think I'm pretty correct about this, but in 2000, I think it's 16, we saw $15 billion of capital coming out of China into the New York real estate market. I think it was $15 billion. And in 2019, a year into the trade war, we saw about $4 billion come into the the New York real estate market out of China. That's an enormous difference, as you can imagine. And so that was an example of DFI drying up as a result of American foreign policy, in this case, the trade war. Are there any questions here on the advantages and disadvantages of globalization?
Professor, what was DFI again, please?
The DFI out of China, I'm pretty sure in 2016 was $15 billion. And 2.5, 3 years later, it was a third of that. As Chinese investors were discouraged from putting or unable to move their money into the US market because of capital controls being placed in China, and also less of an appetite to do business in the US real estate markets following the trade war. One of the most controversial topics to come up around globalization is about Nafta and what the results of Nafta were. And there are people that argue on either side that Nafta was great and Nafta was bad. I'd like to take a moment to talk about Nafta a little bit and see if we can address what was the reality of it. We know that. Hold on a second. I'll come back in a moment. Okay, we're going to hold off on Nafta for the moment. What we are going to do is we're going to talk about multilateral trade. Okay, so we know that multilateral trade occurs across multiple countries. So OPEC sells oil to the United States, or OPEC sells oil to the United States. The United States sells agricultural products into China, and Japan sells semiconductors into the US market. We know that nations that have a deficit with their trading partners that are low-cost suppliers of goods that they import intensely, so that the U.S. runs a trade deficit with countries like China and Mexico. The U.S. maintains a surplus with countries like Hong Kong, Australia, Brazil, and Chile, because they buy many of the things that we supply, right? We buy a lot of stuff from low-cost suppliers and therefore maintain a trade deficit with them. The countries that buy a lot of more stuff from us than we buy from them, they're nations that the U.S. maintains a trade surplus with. So in this example here, we see that OPEC is selling oil to Japan, which sells semiconductors to the United States, which sells airplanes or jet planes to OPEC. That's a good example of multilateral trade between US, Japan, and OPEC. Okay, any questions here? Okay, so the book provides a nice example of decentralized manufacturing with Hewlett-Packard computers. And you see, much like the iPhone, the computer is broken up into its various component parts and farmed out to countries around the world that provide the comparative advantage that's going to accrue right to the bottom line, where they can be produced, cost efficiently in one nation as opposed to another. Here we see examples of outsourcing in countries around the world by major companies, by Dow component companies, by leading companies like Microsoft and GE and Accenture that are moving work like accounting and software design, chip design, and finance information technology to countries around the world. We discussed that the other day about software programmers or software designers in Mumbai that work for a fraction of the cost than those, let's say, in Virginia, and produce exactly the same quality work. You as a business owner or a global manager would, of course, advise your company to pursue that type of opportunity where you could dramatically reduce your overhead costs. So we talk about, again, we talked about advantages and disadvantages. Let's talk about what some of the fallacies or myths are about global trade. Well, we've heard this idea before, that global trade is a zero-sum activity. In fact, we know that it's not. Why? We know that both partners gain from trade. Yes, the idea that when we trade, one party loses and one party wins, that's the thinking of that's a backward way of thinking. It's a regressive way of thinking. We know that there are mutually beneficial trading gains based on comparative advantage, based on specialization exchange, and we have, of course, overwhelming evidence to that. I pointed out in the beginning of the semester, and we're going to discuss it again over the next couple of weeks as we wade into the territory of the evolution of trade theory, that mercantilism was the prevailing theory for the better part of 300 years, between 1500 and 1800. And what was the idea there? A mercantilist believes that imports are bad and exports are good. A mercantilist believes that a country's wealth is based upon the amount of precious metal that it can hold, and that a nation should at all costs maintain a trade surplus. This is a prevailing thinking for the better part of 300 years before we get into classical economic thought, which we'll talk about a little bit later on. But predominantly, the idea that trade is a zero-sum activity, which of course has been disproven extensively. Another fallacy or myth around global trade is that imports reduce employment and burden the economy, and that exports promote growth and unemployment. Well, we've talked a while now about the downstream effects of, we talked about the downstream effects of tariffs. So what happens when the US imposes tariffs on Canadian-made lumber or Chinese aluminum or Canadian steel into the United States? What happens to all the businesses that use, all those domestic businesses that use steel and aluminum in their manufacturing processes? Well, it just makes all that manufacturing that much more expensive, which does what? Which does what?
On US companies.
That's exactly right. That's exactly right. There is always a connection. There's a link between imports and exports. Tariffs and quotas and other import restrictions save jobs and promote a higher level of employment. This is something that the former president advocated, and that he was going to pursue a tariff-driven trade war, and that was going to bring home manufacturing, coal mining jobs, none of which, of course, happened. And again, what does this fail to recognize? That a reduction in imports does not occur in isolation, that there are the downstream effects of tariffs that we just talked about. Another global fallacy or trade myth is that high-wage nations shouldn't trade with low-wage nations, as the low-wage nation will be undersold every time by the high-wage nation. Well, it fails to consider comparative advantage or specialization exchange based on comparative advantages or cost advantages that we've just started to discuss in our last discussion. Another myth that gets I was going to say peddled or gets repeated many times in certain circles is that low productivity nations are harmed through trade with high productivity nations. Why is that not true? Well, it fails to consider the benefits of trade, the danger of isolation, the rise in living standards as a result of global free trade for the nations that participate in global free trade. And finally, the myth that free trade reduces competition and leads to higher prices. Now, you know intuitively as Baruch students, upperclassmen, that that's absolutely not true. That free trade increases competition, lowers prices, makes more and better products available to consumers, resulting in higher consumption, GDP, and living standards. And since the end of World War II, we've seen overwhelming evidence that the U.S. led, or rather, the U.S. modeling free trade for the post-war world has been enormously successful and has lifted hundreds and hundreds of millions of people out of poverty and has led to lots of positive results over the course of the last 75 years. Are there any questions here about global trade fallacies and myths? Okay, then let's move on and turn our attention to Nafta, which is always an interesting topic because lots of people refer to Nafta as a signature regional trading agreement that was a disaster. What people tend to forget is that Mexico's exports surged in the 1990s and that automakers in Detroit were competing with the union-averse South. In other words, states in the South, like South Carolina, where BMW is, that don't like unions. They're right-to-work states. You can't be forced to join a union. So Detroit auto workers were competing not only with the union-averse South and the workers there, but robotics and nanotechnology coming in from Korea and Japanese automakers. Then what happens in 2001? Can anyone tell us? What happens in 2001 with China?
Join WTO, right?
Yes. Am I pronouncing it Taiwan?
Yes.
Thank you very much. That's exactly right. China joins the WTO in 2001 and displaces Mexico as the lowest cost producer. Think of the advantage of the U.S. having a low-cost labor platform, a low-wage labor platform right here in North America, right? Where are we today? Well, today, the auto industry that was on the edge of bankruptcy was effectively bankrupt during the Great Recession and was rescued during the Great Recession by a combination of fiscal and monetary action, that now we have a thriving auto industry that relies constantly on Mexico's low wages for basic production tasks, with higher level jobs in the US, for example, engineers that are in the United States. I drive a Honda CRV, and the Honda CRV is assembled in Mexico with 70% US content, which provides a tremendous comparative advantage for Honda, that they're able to outsource the assembly of the car into Mexico because they can do it at a much lower cost than they would otherwise be able to do. Now, between 2005 and 2013 or 14, we saw a surging yuan, right? So what happens? With the surging yuan, that's got to strengthen Mexico's position as a low-wage production platform in North America, right? Which is exactly what happened. So rising wages in China strengthened Mexico's position as a low-wage platform with Mexican assembly plants, helping to sustain a robust auto parts industry across North America. So what's the conclusion here about Nafta? What have we learned? Nafta now, of course, has been redubbed the USMCA, which I will tell you, for all intents and purposes, is very much the same as the original Nafta. There have been some adjustments, but nothing so comprehensive that it's unrecognizable from the original version. What's the conclusion? The conclusion is that regional integration across countries with complementary labor forces makes large-scale production in North America possible and played a key role in reviving the US auto industry. So when we talk about Nafta, it's important to talk about it in the right context, understanding what preceded it, what's happened since then, and what the conclusion is about this very important regional trading relationship that continues to support American industry in a very profound way. Any questions about this Nafta observation?
Professor, yes. Can you go over one more time what does that mean? The Nafta.
In other words, the benefit of Nafta for the United States is that we have an accessible low-wage production platform right here in North America, and that presents enormous competition for China. And it means that car manufacturing is not going to be dominated by China, that car manufacturing can remain in North America, with part of the job of car manufacturing conducted in the high-wage United States, and part of the job of car manufacturing being conducted in the low-wage production platform that exists just next to our southern border, and provides a tremendous cost advantage and a geopolitical advantage for the United States. Okay, and that it's important to remember that jobs that were lost during the course of Nafta, during the course of the last 35 years or so, that it wasn't just because of Nafta that we lost jobs. It was because of robotics from Korea and from Japanese automakers that have made some jobs obsolete and have led to some job losses. And of course, we point out the competition coming from the union-averse South, where unions are not very popular. Excuse me just a moment, I was looking at a note. How's that, Maria?
Yeah, I understand that part, but then how does China plays a role here? If it's geographically known.
Well, it's a matter of comparison. In other words, in the absence of Mexico as a viable low-wage production platform here in North America, the U.S. would be outsourcing some of its production to China or overseas.
To lower the cost.
To lower the cost. In other words, if they're not outsourcing to China, to Mexico, they would outsource to China. And with that being said, as a result of Nafta and the success of it, Mexico has continued to maintain its position as an important destination for car manufacturing. Another very interesting thing about Mexico is that not only did Mexico spend many years developing its comparative advantage in car manufacturing, but what else have they developed a comparative advantage over the course of the last 20 years that have made them a destination for companies like Boeing and Airbus and all the other international aerospace companies?
Tourism.
Excuse me?
Tourism.
Tourism, no. Boeing, aerospace companies, what is it that they want?
Energy,
I'm thinking of semiconductors. Mexico's become a platform for semiconductor production. So they've developed an expertise, just the way we have the technological workforce that was developed in India, Mexico, and the Japanese developed their expertise in electronics after World War II. Mexico has spent decades developing their competitive edge in the auto industry and also in the semiconductor industry. Is that satisfying, Maria?
very satisfying.
Okay, good. Please come back to me with any more questions. So one of the things we want to take a moment to look about is, let's take a moment to talk about are companies that didn't keep up. I like the idea that, like students who are trying to remain competitive in the 21st century by developing your skill sets in a class like this and other classes, internships, and all the various activities that I know you pursue, you're always trying to stay current. Well, companies that don't stay current are left behind. And we have multiple examples of that. Let's just take a look at some of the most well-known examples. So when I was a kid growing up back in the 1970s, Kodak was
the thing.
Kodak was the big company in photography. It was Kodak and Polaroid, which had the Polaroid instant camera. But Kodak, in the times of your life, we saw those commercials constantly. And as I point out here, they had 90% of the camera market back in 1976. What happened though? They got a bit lazy. They didn't address competition and new technology. And what did they basically do with regard to digital camera technology?
They ignored it.
Thank you.
Well,
they ignored it. They ignored it.
Didn't Kodak start with digital camera? They were the first one who developed digital camera, but then they didn't follow it.
Well, they ignored the bigger threat, and Fuji entered the market in the US with lower prices. And what happens? They developed the digital camera too late, and they were undercut by smartphones, and they filed for bankruptcy in 2012. Another company that fell by the wayside were Schwinn Bicycles. When I was a kid growing up in the 70s, having a Schwinn was a cool thing. Okay, Schwinn was the bicycle of choice for athletes and for kids and bicyclists and hobbyists all over the country, right? They were the industry standard that had survived the Great Depression, that had continued to innovate, building durable, stylish models. Does anybody know what the problem was though with Schwinn Bicycles?
They were heavy, I think.
They were too heavy. Very good. That's great.
I read that.
I love that. I love that. They were too heavy. They were too heavy. See that butt too heavy. You were right on the money. So what happens? Competitors introduced lightweight bicycles. Lightweight bicycles that were cheaper to import, that entered the market, and that was it for Schwinn Bicycles that declared bankruptcy in '92, with most bicycles now made in China. Some other examples we have of companies, of important companies that failed to innovate, failed to remain current, failed to change their product mix to diversify their talent pool, that have declared bankruptcy. Polaroid, which was all the rage for its instant cameras, they filed for bankruptcy in 2001. Another company that didn't remain competitive as digital photography took off. I don't know if you're too young to remember, Blockbuster Video was a huge nationwide company that failed to transition as we were moving, everything was becoming more digitized. And
by the way, Blockbuster, they were offered to purchase Netflix, but they refused.
can you repeat that?
I said that Blockbuster were offered to purchase Netflix.
That's right. Sahar, that's absolutely right. Blockbuster had been given an opportunity to purchase Netflix and they passed. Talk about a missed opportunity, right?
Yeah.
My goodness, that is absolutely right. Excellent, excellent, Sahar, thank you. And the final example I gave you here was Borders Bookstore. You had Borders and Barnes and Noble. They were the two big companies in the bookstore business. And then what happened in 1998? Who came around?
Bezos.
Amazon.
Jeff Bezos.
Amazon.
Jeff Bezos, that was his entry point into digital merchandising, which was books. And he disrupted the entire industry. And Borders, excuse me for the phone, folks. I'm sorry. I'm not in my own house right now for a couple of days. I've got some business down in Florida. So I apologize for any background noise that is that you may be hearing. So again, Borders filed bankruptcy in 2011, having been far less quick to respond to some of the incoming threats from digital bookstores like Amazon, and they filed for bankruptcy in 2011. One other condition I want to talk about here is the concept of reshoring. Now, there used to be 150 or so US manufacturers of televisions that were displaced by imports from Japan, China, and South Korea. What happened? Well, they developed flat panel TVs that were lighter and cheaper to ship and nicer than the big boxy TVs that we were manufacturing here in the United States. So that by 2000, there was no domestic television manufacturing here in the United States. Again, though, what happens? The yuan strengthens between 2005 and 13 and 14, and you start to see some reshoring as US manufacturing becomes more competitive, and you see the return of some TV manufacturing right back here into the United States as a result of a strengthening yuan and a weaker market there for television production. Okay, any questions on this slide here? Okay, pardon me. So reshoring is a trend that we have seen here and there, not only for TV manufacturing, but basic manufacturing that we would see, manufacturing that we've seen in China, looking for lower cost economies, whether it's Malaysia or Vietnam, not just coming back to the US, but moving offshore to lower cost labor markets. Now, since we're rounding the corner and we're about to finish our section on the global capital markets, our introductory session on the global capital markets, along with globalization in chapter 1 in the Corbo text, I want to go over some of the basic macroeconomic material that you need to perform in this class, and that I want to make sure everybody is up to speed on. So when we go through this, if there are any questions, please jump out at me. For some of you, if not all of you, this will be a repeat of work you've done before. That's okay. But for some of you, of course, it may not be, and that's why I want to make sure that we're all exactly the same page. So with that said, what are the goals of a fully functioning economy? Consistent economic growth, stable prices, and low unemployment. Let's talk about different types of goods. What's a normal good? A normal good is one that has elastic demand. What does that mean? That when the price goes up, demand falls, right? And we know the price elasticity of demand is negative. So the correlation is an inverse correlation. Price goes up, quantity demanded goes down, okay? An inelastic good means that regardless of the price, people are going to buy the good anyway. And typically we categorize those as being essentials like energy, food, and healthcare, that people will spend what they have to spend to secure energy, food, or healthcare. Excuse me. Next, we talk about an inferior good, where, of course, the quantity demanded decreases when income increases. And the example I give here is the example that I give is fast food. Typically, when people start to make more money as they progress in their career, they stop buying less McDonald's and Burger King and stuff like that. Pardon me. Does anybody tell us what a Giffen good is?
Gifton? Sounds like
Giffen good.
I think it's the kind of good where demand rises when income falls.
Demand rises when income falls. Demand also rises when prices increase. Right?
Right.
Right. So a Giffen good violates the law of demand because both price and quantity increase. So it's typically an inferior staple good like rice, where the demand, as you point out, is driven by economic distress because consumers can't afford superior goods like beef. That's a Giffen good. So elastic, inelastic, inferior, Giffen, and finally an alternate good. An alternate good is one that can be produced using virtually all the same inputs as another good. The example I like, as I drive a Honda, is that Honda can switch productions easily in a factory from an Accord to a Prelude, depending upon what demand schedules are looking like in every period of time, right? Without having to significantly alter their production processes. Let's do a quick review of different types of unemployment. Well, we know that there's frictional or functional unemployment. What does that mean? It means people are always coming in and out of the labor markets, right? So that's short-term joblessness, people always moving into and out of the labor markets. We talk about seasonal unemployment as a factor of weather or tourist patterns. Has anybody here worked over the summer as a waiter in a restaurant or on the beach as a lifeguard or some other type of summer job that only exists during the summer or maybe during the winter break? That's seasonal unemployment.
Oh, Professor, I have a question. Are we going to go over Vaven goods?
We're not going to go over Vaven goods. We're not going to go over it tonight, maybe because you brought it up. We'll talk about it on Monday. But right now, we're not. If you want to discuss it, go ahead, please. What's a Vaven good?
Isn't it like the exact opposite of a Giffen good? Where, I'm sorry, it's, I'm having trouble remembering. It's like a high quality, good, and it's, the opposite of inferior product, and it doesn't have a lot of easy substitutes, I believe.
Okay, so it's a unique good that's high priced, doesn't have a lot of easy substitutes, and is in high demand, yes?
Yeah. Like the higher the price, like the more people buy it. Or like it's something like
right, so the higher the price of, let's say, can you give us an example of a Vaven good?
Like a Lamborghini or something to show off your wealth.
I was thinking of yeah, I agree with you. Okay. Lamborghini's good. Lamborghini's good. Maserati's better, but no, I'm just kidding. But that's very good. So that's a Vaven good, but I'm not gonna test you on that, but thank you. So on types of unemployment, we said there's unemployment that's always happening, frictional or functional unemployment, there's seasonal unemployment, and finally there's structural unemployment. Structural unemployment is just long-term unemployment that's often due to the mismatch between skills and location. There might be jobs available in California that are engineering jobs, but the engineers are on the East Coast. Usually a mismatch between skills, location, and available jobs. So that's structural or long-term unemployment. The next thing I want to talk about in our brief review of some macroeconomics is what happens to supply when a variety of factors change. So what happens to the market supply when the cost of goods sold or the price of inputs, when the price of inputs increase? Well, the supply falls. When the price of an alternate good increases, well, the supply of the first good falls because the supply of the more expensive second good is more profitable. When the number of firms increase, you're going to see a greater supply. When the expected price increases, the supply that's made available today is going to shrink because producers would rather wait until the price increases. If there's an increase in technology, well, then of course supply increases. And finally, if there's an increase in the price of transportation, supply is going to fall. At the same time, we see that if any of those things decrease, the exact opposite happens. So if cost of goods sold or the price of inputs decrease and the supply increases, so on and so forth. Are there any questions here? Again, I'm not going to spend a lot of time here because this should more or less be a review. Any questions though?
I do have a question.
Please go ahead.
Can you clarify one more time? What do you mean?
What is an alternate good?
Yes, please.
Okay, so an alternate good is one that can be used instead of, right? If I'm Honda and I sell Honda Preludes and Accords, well, if the price of the Accord is going up, well, I'm going to stop supplying as many Preludes. Does that satisfy you?
No, really.
An alternate good, one that does exactly the same thing. Yes?
Yeah.
Right? Okay. So if the price of a widget is going to, the price of, let's say the price of, let's think.
Rice.
Pardon me?
The price of the rice. I'm still confused with the gifted goods.
A gifting good. A gifting good, you're a low-income person and you can't afford beef. And the price, there's only one supplier of rice in your town or your village. We see this often in rural communities where there are very few dealers or very few available sources of food, for example. And the one available source for food is going to increase the price of flour and rice that you're going to pay because you don't have any money to buy an alternate good. That's a gifting good. That it's an inferior quality good where even though the price is increasing, your quantity, the amount that you're going to buy is going to remain consistent or increase.
Okay.
Okay. An alternate good is just the same good. So different types of BMWs or Hondas or a different type of surfboard or a skateboard. So if you like to skateboard, I used to do that as a kid. So if the price of an alternate skateboard is going to increase, if a company produces two types of skateboards and one of them looks as though there's going to be an opportunity to increase prices over Christmas, well, we're going to wait and we're going to hold on to we're going to hold off on that more expensive supply until the Christmas season, and then we're going to flood the markets with our more expensive skateboard. Does that help?
It does.
Good, thank you. I appreciate that. So we talk about changes to market demand. It's a little more comprehensive, but we talk about what happens to market demand when income changes, the price of a substitute or complement, population, expected prices, consumer tastes, unemployment, inflation, energy, education, and interest rates. So obviously as income increases, demand increases for all sorts of things across the board. When the price of a substitute increases, what happens for the demand of the first good? Well, if you get back to our example of the expensive skateboards, if the price of the substitute skateboard is going up, well, the demand for the lower price skateboard is likely to increase, just like it would in the example of the Honda Accord or the Honda Prelude. If the Honda Prelude is increasing, well, they're going to supply more of the Prelude, but demand for the Accord will increase because it's less expensive. Pardon me. With an increase in population, of course, demand increases. If people expect prices to increase, demand increases today. If consumer tastes favor a particular product, well, then demand increases. If consumer tastes change or consumer tastes no longer favor a particular product, well, then, of course, demand for that product could collapse. Back in the 1990s, the single most popular car well, one of the most popular cars was the Ford Explorer. Have any of you ever had a Ford Explorer? Okay, so the Ford Explorer was an early SUV that was America's answer to the Range Rover coming out of England. And the demand for the Ford Explorer was so huge that Ford built 3 plants dedicated to its production. One of the problems was that these billion-dollar plants couldn't really produce any other cars other than the Ford Explorer. It didn't matter when demand was through the roof for this Ford Explorer. What begins to happen in the late 1990s with regard to consumers and their perception of these gas-guzzling vehicles? Can anyone tell us what happens in the late 1990s? People start becoming more concerned about the environment. And so demand for the Ford Explorer plummeted and plunged Ford into one of its bankruptcies. Yes, and saddled Ford with billion-dollar plants that couldn't produce anything else, that eventually they sold at a tremendous loss, and had to reorganize their finances as a result of the boondoggle or the what turned out to be a major disaster with the Ford Explorer, which, when consumer attitudes changed towards these big energy inefficient vehicles, really had a terrible effect on their demand schedule. And then, of course, we see when all of these things decrease, what the effects are. So if energy costs decrease, demand increases. Education costs decrease, demand increases. Again, if consumer tastes decrease, as they did with the Ford Explorer, demand fell, in this case, through the floor. Are there any questions on this, this legend here? Okay, pardon me. They say Florida is hot. It is hot. I look forward to being back in chilly New York next week. Although I heard it's pretty nice today up in New York, right? In the 50s?
Yeah, not bad.
Yeah,
Lucky you. Fantastic. That is the most beautiful weather. Gotta love it. Okay, folks, let's move on. Let me tell you where we are. We're about at the, we're going to do, I'd like to see if we can get to some hedging after this. Over the next number of sessions, we're going to talk about the evolution of trade theory, among other things. We've already discussed a number of key things. We've talked about mercantilism. I referred to John Maynard Keynes, the father of modern economics, multiple times here in this class as a key advisor to Franklin Roosevelt during the Great Depression and helped develop the ideas behind the New Deal. I'd like to expand on that discussion a little bit tonight in advance of what's going to be more granular work on this, the evolution of modern trade theory, next week. And that's chapter 2 of the book, which you should have completed by next week. So let's take a look here. Right, so what is classical economic theory? It's a long-run theory that's based on what we call the market clearing function. What's the market clearing function? That the price adjusts until the quantity demand and the quantity supplied are in perfect equilibrium. Now, back in 1815, remember, from 1500 to 1800, we had mercantilism. Thinking begins to evolve in the late 1700s, early 1800s. A famous economist named Jean-Baptiste Say, a French economist, developed what's referred to as Say's law. And what did he say? He said that supply creates its own demand. That's fantastic. What does it mean? It means if you produce it, people are going to buy it, right? It means that demand will always be sufficient to absorb all the goods and services that a fully employed economy can produce. That the government doesn't need to worry about employment because full employment is achieved automatically. That an economy will operate at full potential automatically. That full employment, as I say here, is achieved on its own because total spending will always equal total output. Think about that. Supply creates its own demand. If I produce it, people will come and buy my goods.
Doesn't sound right. Doesn't sound right.
Well, of course it's not right, but this is classical economic theory and was the prevailing school of thought for the better part of 100 years. And so again, the economy will operate at or near full potential automatically. What's the problem that Keynes addressed here is that it doesn't recognize that there are short-term disruptions to longer-term trends. We looked at the Dow that goes like this and GDP that goes up. The trend may be upward, but there are peaks and valleys along the way, and there are short-term disruptions. What do we call those short-term disruptions? Contractions, recessions, sometimes a depression. Yes?
Yeah.
So classical economic theory persists between 1815 and into the early part of the 20th century with adjustments along the way. And we're going to talk about some of those great economic thinkers and trade theorists over the course of the next number of sessions. Tonight, I just wanted to introduce two fundamental concepts behind classical economic theory and modern economic theory. So in modern economic theory, cheap money was not enough to end the Great Depression. What is cheap money? Low interest rates, yes? And so, well, who comes along? John Keynes, the English great British economist, who recognized short-term disruption to long-term trends. And as we've discussed, I know in class before, he advocated aggressive monetary and fiscal policy action to stabilize output and stimulate demand during times of economic distress in the name of self-interest, the self-interest of the country, and also compassion for the country's citizens. He said that the long-run welfare of the nation was tied to the long-run welfare of its citizens, which was also its labor force. That was just what Henry Ford was saying 20 years earlier when he said he started talking about stakeholder capitalism and that his employees were his customers. He was 100% right about that. And he knew that the welfare of his company was tied to the welfare of his employees and paid them higher than the prevailing wage, provided them with a better standard of living than was otherwise available. And of course, all of that very progressive thinking accrued directly to the bottom line of Ford. That was one of the biggest successes of the industrial age. What's so important about Keynes is you cannot underestimate what a revolution in thinking it was. It was a revolution in thinking focused on what could be changed as opposed to what couldn't be changed. Because under classical economic theory, the dogma was there's nothing you can do. Everything happens automatically. What is the advice for the government? Hands off. Everything's going to happen automatically. Supply will create its own demand. Full employment will be achieved on its own. There's nothing the government has to do. Well, that's good as long as nothing bad happens. And what's the truth is that bad things happen. And bad things did happen. We had, of course, the Gilded Age in the 1920s and soaring income inequality. And then we had the Great Depression beginning in the late 1920s. So what's the top line kind of headline conclusion here? Well, first, of course, that aggregate demand, as we know, the components of GDP, consumption, planned investment spending, government spending, net exports, that growth has to come from one of these, which is why if consumers aren't spending, CapEx is down and exports are negligible. Net exports are negligible, then the government has to step in, which is what we've seen multiple times, whether it was during the Great Depression, in subsequent recessions, between the Great Depression and the Great Recession in 2007, 8, 9, and 10, and now, of course, during the COVID-driven pandemic that has had an extraordinarily negative effect on the economics of the country and millions of its citizens. And so, as I said, the top line headline analysis is that classical economic theory could not explain short-run fluctuations, right? That total spending doesn't always equal total output because there are short-run disruptions to longer-term trends that disrupt those virtual cycles of growth of spending, income, and production that we talked about as the traditional growth model here in the United States. everything's fine when everything is humming along nicely, and there's no interruption to that virtuous cycle of growth. But of course, contractions, recessions, and depressions are exactly that. Are there any questions on this sort of very brief introduction in any greater detail than we've done just as we've been chatting in class about classical economic theory or modern economic theory? As I said, we're going to get into some interesting granular detail about the evolution of modern economic theory, modern trade theory next week in chapter 2. And of course, as questions arise, you'll certainly bring them to me in class and outside of classes, some of you have done in the last number of weeks through email. In our remaining 15 minutes, we've made more progress than I thought we would, which is great. I want to return to this example here that we looked at on Monday. We had a firm with accounts receivable of £1 million Great British pounds. And what did we see? We saw that the company could either take out a forward hedge. Well, what was the company's fear? Somebody tell me that. What was the company afraid of? You're getting £1 million in 6 months. You want to convert the pounds into dollars. What's your fear?
Depreciation of the value between the dollars and your money.
That's right, Sahar. He's exactly right. Your concern is that the pound will depreciate over the course of the next 6 months, and you're buying fewer dollars in 6 months than you would otherwise be buying at time zero. And so we've looked now just at 2 examples of ways that the company can hedge itself. It can buy a forward hedge, enter into agreement today with a bank that says we're going to agree to trade your incoming pounds at an exchange rate at what we call a strike price, an agreed upon price at which you can exercise that exchange. And in this case, it was $1.29 that gave the company a guarantee of $1,290,000 in 6 months. The other option we had was to take out a money market hedge, which is what? The company is taking money, borrowing money against the value, the present value of its receivables today. It's creating a money market liability, which is a loan that is going to be paid off by the receivable at the end of the term, in this case, 6 months. The receivable is going to retire the principal balance plus the interest on the loan. What's great for you as the business owner or the global manager is that you got all of your money, excuse me for the phone, folks, I apologize, is that you get all of your money today, and then you can invest your money or do whatever you want to deploy it. Pardon me. There are other people in this house. You don't know if that's coming for me. So, but thank you. So here we have our pound-denominated liability, which is our bank loan, offset by our incoming accounts receivable. So at time zero, you're getting how much out of the money market hedge? You're getting $1,265,700, right? Well, you're getting $265,700 at time zero. The forward hedge proceeds are $1,290,000. There has to be a break-even rate, a rate at which you're indifferent between either one of these hedging strategies, okay? Because in this case, what did we choose? We said that the money market hedge is the more profitable pathway, the more profitable hedge, and therefore the company should choose the money market hedge. Well, let's see what happens if we try to derive the break-even rate. We say the loan proceeds, which is $1,265,000 times 1 plus R, present value times 1 plus R equals our forward proceeds. So what is the rate that we need to be indifferent between the two? The rate that we would need is 1.92%, or you multiply that by 2 to get an annualized rate, gives us 3.83%. Excuse me just 1 second. I'm going to stop sharing for just a moment. Just give me a moment, folks. Okay. 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 Okay, folks, I'm back. Okay. So let's look at this example. If you have your calculators ready. Here we have an example where the company has a receivable due in 3 months of £1 million. The UK rate is 10%. I got my calculator. The US rate is 4%. This is the rates that were available to this company. Okay. The pound spot was $1.764. The 3-month pound forward was $1.754, which meant that the markets were hard or soft on the pound.
Soft.
They were soft on the pound. And the company's expected pound spot rate in 3 months was $1.76 between the two. So let's see here. The forward hedge is going to generate $1,754,000, right? You said your £1,000,000 coming in. The bank agrees to exchange them at 1,754. That gives you $1,754,000. What if you want to create a money market hedge? Borrow against your £1,000,000 today, discounted at 10%. So let's see. Well, you've got to discount it at 10%, but you've got to take it as a quarterly number, right? Because the 1-year UK, that's a 1-year UK rate. It should specify a 1-year UK rate. It will in the notes I post after class, right? So you have to take a quarter of that. It's 2.5%. So you're discounting your future value of your receivables by the relevant 3-month rate, which is 2.5%. Tells you that your pound receivable is worth $975,610 today, which is what you borrow. You convert it at the prevailing spot rate, and you end up with $1,720,976, which you can do with whatever you want. But you've taken your money out of the market today, and you have no exposure because the money market liability that you created, the pound-denominated loan, is going to be retired by the pound receivable that comes in 3 months. So we see that the interest rate is $24,390, which plus the $975,610 equals exactly $1 million. Yes. If you invested at 1%, which is 1/4 of the 4% rate. Again, this is a 1-year rate, and the notes I post tonight will specify it's a 1-year US rate and 1-year UK rate. You end up with $1,738,186. So which one would you choose? Of course, you choose the forward hedge because it's going to generate more money for you. It's going to optimize the value. Yes?
Yes.
Now let's move forward and see if we can find the break-even rate. Well, so the money market hedge gives us $1,738,186. The forward hedge hold on a second, folks. We did. Did we just do this exact example? No. No, we did not.
No.
No, we did not. Okay. No, we did not. Okay, we're going to leave it there. We're going to leave it there. Okay, I'm going to give you one more thing before we close out tonight. I got a couple of notes to go over with you. That's all on hedging right now. We're not going to do the break even on that. We'll continue with hedging on Monday. Some of you came back to me with questions after class on Monday about the we talked about key regional, national, multinational trade agreements and financial institutions. We talked about TPP and the JCPOA and the Paris Climate Accord and the Exim Bank and Dodd-Frank, the Volcker Rule, the World Bank, so on and so forth, and asked me to explain a few things. I have a list here that I'm going to post with your notes. I'm not going to test you on this. This is meant for your edification so that it's a resource for you. Oh, sorry. Okay, I'm going to post this for you. This is a summary of all of those regional, national, multinational trade agreements and financial institutions that I listed for you. So you have them here. Pardon me? Yeah. Sorry about that. My mistake. Apologize. So here you go. This is a summary for your edification of all the things that I listed. Gives you more detail on 2 pages. Okay? And I'm going to post for you this evening the notes from class tonight. I'm also going to post for you a summary of the capital markets work we've done so far. I think it's a 3 or 4 page summary. I'm also going to post for you and assign to you a problem set on the capital markets work we've done so far. I'm going to also assign to you chapter 1 homework. So this is your first homework for the class. It's a problem set with about 25 questions, multiple choice. Go through them at your leisure over the course of the next number of days. I'm going to post answers to everything next Monday. So you have 2 homework assignments. The problem set I'm going to post for you along with the problems, the questions in the end of chapter 1 in Carbo, and also to have made your way through at least the first half of chapter 2 for next Monday. And that's it. I want to thank you for your attention this evening, for 2 good classes this week. I appreciate the comments and questions that are coming in. Actually, before I let you go, I've got 2 or 3 emails I need to respond to. I've had some additional responsibilities this week, both family and business here in Florida, that has me a little bit behind on my email responses to you. I got some the other day. I try to get back in touch with you within 24 hours. I'm a bit delayed this week. I promise you'll have them shortly for those of you that are waiting on responses from me. I appreciate that. And
hey, sorry, Professor. Where do we submit that homework?
You don't submit the homework. The homework isn't submitted. My policy is I'm assigning the homework to you. It's your responsibility to do the homework that's assigned, both that I provide you for the problem set, as well as those problems that are assigned in the book. I recommend that you do them and don't wait until I post the answers. I do not collect the homework. You're upperclassmen, it's your responsibility to do it. We have 3 exams. I don't need to see your homework. If there are questions that come up with the homework, then of course you'll should come back and ask me. My expectation is that you will take the initiative to do the work on your own. Is that a fair answer, Brian?
Very fair. Thank you very much, Professor.
Okay, so that's all I really have for you tonight. Thank you very much again. I wish you a good, safe continuation of your evening, of your week, and look forward to seeing you all again on Monday. Okay, good night, everyone. The stuff will be up within the next hour, okay?
Okay, perfect.
Thank you, Professor.
Is it in chapter
Bye.
1?
Thank you, Marco.
Chapter 1, there's homework. Check the syllabus for the questions that are assigned at the end of chapter 1. And I'm going to post for you tonight with the slides an additional problem set on the capital markets and the work that we've done on the material I provided for you. It should be a good barometer of how much you've been absorbing over the course of the beginning of the semester, what was only a few weeks ago. Okay? And when questions arise, you'll come back to me and we'll discuss it all on Monday.
Professor?
Mm-hmm. Hey, Fawazah.
Hi, Professor. Regarding the supply and demand, how does transportation affect supply? I didn't get that.
Well, think about that. If transportation costs increase, if logistics costs increase, well, then that means you're shipping fewer goods overseas, right?
Yeah.
If logistics costs are reduced as a result of improvements in technology, containerization, broadband, all of those things that have driven logistics costs down, well, of course, that's going to increase supply. Yes?
Yeah, you're right. Yeah, makes sense.
Okay. You're welcome. Thank you very much, everybody. Good night from the Sunshine State.
Bye-bye.
Bye, everybody.
Good night.